because I've been telling people Jesus got the juice from the squeeze of life more than any 4 a.m. gym bro. Even though they're up at 4 a.m. and trading stocks and everything, I look at Jesus for the examples. It's like, how do I maximize my life? Stop hurrying. I don't think that he ever gave the impression to people that he was rushing them or that they were not important or that he was moving on to the next thing. He engaged with people right where they were at. He engaged with people in the moment. He accepted that as a gift, but he was also recognizing something bigger was at play. And I think that the more we model that in our lives, the better everything else goes.
Hello and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are here back with another one of our Extraordinary at Ordinary episodes. This time we are with somebody who is more of a contemporary of my age and somebody who Jonathan and I have talked and interacted with quite a lot. But I think you will see over the course of our conversation, he is a really fascinating individual to have a conversation with and has had some really unique experiences that I think a lot of people find interesting.
And if you haven't already, if you want to go back a few episodes and listen to David and I having a discussion about what is a different way to go about the college years. And I can't remember the exact title of that episode, so I should know the name of it.
Rethinking the value of higher education. There it is.
But it's back 3 or 4, maybe 5 from this one. Then you might have an interesting preamble to the conversation we're about to have. So allow us to introduce you to our friend, Seth Showalter. Seth Showalter, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. And for Seth, it's not like this is his first Be Unbound podcast. It's just that normally he's been on the other end. So early on, and for a while, Seth was the editor for the Be Unbound podcast, as well as some other podcasts that we've done over the years. He is no longer doing that. He's moved on to some other things. But I think this is the first time we've had him as a guest on the podcast. So it's fun to have him on this side of the microphone, so to speak. I know Seth as a really close friend, as somebody that I delight to spend a lot of time with, and as somebody who I've had a front row seat in watching transition from high school to post high school and beginning his career and all those kinds of things. I think he has a pretty unique story, as well as being a pretty unique and cool person. And so I thought he absolutely qualified to be on the podcast. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of that story with all of you. And so, Seth, welcome to the podcast. And start with telling us a little bit about how you got to where you are now.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah. So I graduated high school and was kind of floating, didn't really know what to do. And so ended up getting a job at Chick-fil-A. And that was really good for a season. I got to bat around a lot of big faith questions with a lot of my coworkers. And that was a lot of fun, really developmental time for me. And then soon after that, ended up going to a company called Interchange, where I worked in shipping and logistics for a little while. And then that was great. And I really enjoyed it. And there were some fantastic people there and got to do some brand new things. But then after a while of being there, wanted to grow a little bit more and made the connection with my brother-in-law, who's working at a wealth management firm. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm basically on the track to become, I'm an assistant financial advisor pretty much right now.
And in the course of all that, you've been doing some academic work and you're on a path to complete your degree. But that is a path that's kind of been sort of second or third priority as you've gone through these other things. Is that a fair way to say that, Seth?
Yeah. I started with what was Merit at the time and took my courses through them and then kept going. It got switched over to Pearson. And then after that, I ended up graduating from Waldorf Online. And so it was always something that I was kind of chipping away on the background. But just a couple months ago, I finished up my degree in organizational leadership. But yeah, definitely something that took a backseat to everything. But that worked out well because I was able to work full time through that whole process.
I started to say that, and then I wasn't sure if I remembered that correctly or not. So I'm sorry for misremembering. I was like, he finished. He didn't finish. I wasn't sure. And so anyhow, I ended up going the safe route. I should have gone the other way. Merit would have been the predecessor to Unbound. And so same company, a little different name, long story there. So Seth was, I think that the cool term now is he was an OG for Unbound, and that had started that way. I've probably had more deep discussions with Seth more than anybody else outside of my family. And so we could go a lot of different ways with this. But in this case, I wanted to kind of profile this, not really as an Unbound thing, but more as a alternative thing. So not too long ago, David and I did a podcast where we were talking to each other and we were discussing the fact that there's so many people that think that there's only one way to do college or one way to do success. And we were really questioning that and saying, look, if you go to college, it's not just that you're spending money, but you're also losing income. Like, you're taking those years where you're losing income. And we ran some different scenarios. David talked about the average salary has not changed much for college graduates. I talked about the fact that if you, save some of that money and you can do a lot of different things with it. And that's all theoretical. But Seth, you've got something that's not theoretical. You've got a real life that you've lived here. And so now we're going to kind of get uncomfortable for a second and we'll come back here. If you tell most people, hey, I decided to graduate high school, not go to college and work for Chick-fil-A, people are kind of going, really? But if you don't mind, and this is the one place, Seth, where it's actually okay for you to toot your horn a little bit, describe some of the rest of your life now in terms of where you live and some of those things, because I think that that's going to bust some of those stereotypes that we might have about somebody who doesn't go to college and instead goes to work.
Yeah. Yeah. So during that time, when I first started working at Chick-fil-A, and even when I started working at Chick-fil-A before I started taking classes online, but I was very obsessive about saving and I did not spend any money at all. And so
I can testify that's true as somebody who knew Seth during this time. Yeah. So,
yep. And I'm still working my way out of that. But yeah, it worked out well because I was working at Chick-fil-A, which is not a high income job, but I was staying at my parents' home the whole time and they were charging me rent. And so when you're doing that and you do that for a couple of years, you're able to kind of build up a little bit. And so I was fortunate to be able to be in that situation for a little while. Just over, I think, 2.5 years ago now, I ended up buying a house about just outside of Harrisonburg, 20 minutes outside Harrisonburg. I moved out for a little while to one of my buddies had a place that he was generous enough to rent me for a very affordable price. I probably would not have moved out of my parents' house if that had not been available. And so yeah, that was the first leap, and then stayed there for about 7 months. And then he was moving into a different life situation and getting married. And so I didn't want to stay there because I was like, man, well, if I'm going to keep, spending money on housing, I want it to be for something that will last. And I found out since then that owning a home is actually more expensive than renting affordably. And so for the reasons that I thought that I was wanting to buy a house, I would not have bought a house, but for all the other reasons that I was not expecting, all the other benefits that I was not expecting, I'm glad that I did.
So just so that the audience has context here, how old were you when you bought the house?
22.
Let that sink in for a second, everybody.
And how old are you now, Seth?
24.
So, and this is kind of what I wanted to profile, because I think, when David and I did the episode earlier, I think sometimes people listen to that and go, yeah, that's all great on paper. And we flat admitted, like, yeah, this is all great on paper. And we're not saying that this is exactly the way it works out. And that's not exactly what our scenario wasn't necessarily your perfect scenario in terms of like a match. But yet, I think, Seth, your story is really interesting. So, to recap, you went to work for Chick-fil-A. You moved into, I would consider, a professional job that had a professional future. So your job at Interchange was a not necessarily an entry level job. It was a job that had an upside with a growing company, and you had a lot of opportunities there. And then your switch to wealth management firm was more of a switch for the ability to learn new things than anything else. Mm-hmm. And so now, 24, you're sitting on having been a homeowner for 2 years? Is that correct? 2.5 years? What'd you say? So you're a homeowner for two years. I know that you're also somebody who's had people renting from you as you've rented out some rooms to that house. You're continuing to progress in your career. You did finish your degree, and you're not sitting on a pile of college debt, and you do have a financial base in terms of savings and some assets and things like that. And so that's the part that I kind of thought was worth highlighting, but let's make sure that we don't sort of paint this as one all rosy picture. So let's go on the other side of it. What was the hardest part of all that, Seth? Because that's not an inconsequential amount of work. So what was the part that was the most difficult as you think about that period between finishing high school and where you are now?
I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to pinpoint. I look at it like a huge gift because a lot of it was just my little habits that come naturally to me and drag me into places I don't want to be if they, make the most of me. But at the same time, like obsessively saving and not wanting to spend anything, for me, if I don't keep that in check, it's kind of like the parable of the man with the barns. How can I build my bigger barns and fill them up, and then I can be fully self-sufficient and not need anybody else for anything? And so I think that's why I just naturally end up saving. And so, and then the whole process for I guess financially being where I am now was not anything that it didn't take. It felt like it didn't take sacrifice for me because I think that a big part of it too was growing up. I remember when I was younger, I would have spent all of my money that I had been given on Lego sets. And my parents were always saying, no, you're not allowed to. And I'm like, but it's my money. And so they wouldn't even let me spend my own money on Lego sets because I would have spent it all. And so I'm grateful for that because I think that's kind of the root of what instilled in me. Okay, like I can have the Lego set now. And this is still how I think through things. I'm going, okay, I have however much money to work with. I can have, I can go out to eat, buy a $10 sandwich every day for 360 days out of the year, or I can, what else can I do with $3,600, And so it just kind of, I always take a look at the little things, any recurring transaction or any subscription or anything like that. No, I've been really, really picky about just because that's kind of the way my mind actually goes.
And so, when you first started this, when you graduated from high school and end up going Chick-fil-A and then kind of hanging in with that and continue to go forward, was the motivation of that purely a financial one, or what was it that put you on that track and had you thinking in those terms?
Chick-fil-A was really just coincidence.
Right.
I really just, I was thinking, okay, I probably should get a job. And my mom was,
But I mean more like not so much the Chick-fil-A, but the fact that you graduated high school and went to work instead of graduating high school and following that traditional kind of college track. What was the kind of switch that said, because it's not like so just for everybody knows, Seth's an excellent student, and it's not like he couldn't get into college, right? I mean, there was all kinds of college options to go almost anywhere he would have wanted to go. So what was it that kind of bounced you from like I could go to college, do this whole thing, take some loans, finish up, do that, versus I'm going to stay here and work. And I think it's even more interesting because Chick-fil-A is not like this super glamorous, enormously high paying job where it's like, well, it'd be dumb for me to go to college because I'm making bank over here. This was hard work, serious hours, and, in a place that you knew you weren't looking at a long term future with. And so, what was it that kind of put you on that path rather than the more quote unquote traditional path?
yeah. At first, it really was not an intentional decision. It was just, that was kind of the thing. My dad had gone to college for a year and he didn't really know what he was going to go for. And so that was something that my parents had always kind of cautioned me against was don't go to college if you don't know where you're going to go for. And I was thinking, well, I have no idea what the heck I want to do. And so any job that I've been at, it usually takes about a year until I actually start kind of finding my groove and enjoying it. After I had been at Chick-fil-A for a little bit, I remember at first it was very, very difficult because I feel like my brain even works differently because my hands were not doing the things that everybody else just got so naturally. It takes me a while to pick up on it, to learn those things. But then after being there for a while, I started noticing things. And so one of the things that that had happened at that store was they had hired a cleaning crew to work overnight. And so it didn't work very well because there was an outside team that was coming in. They would clean the store. And so theoretically on paper, they would bring in 2 or 3 people. And so instead of keeping the entire team there for an hour or so after close, they would just bring in a couple people. They'd be able to work longer, but your overall labor hours were less. And so it kind of shifted into like an us them mentality was part of it. And then it was also everybody who was coming in was not familiar with the store at all. And so I had the thought, hey, we could actually do this with ourselves. And so I wrote up a proposal to be able to clean the store with people internally overnight. And I wanted to lead that team. And that was something that I was really, really excited about doing. But that didn't end up working out. But what it did end up doing was leading to another conversation with someone who's quite the businessman in the area. And then that connection is really what enabled my next to both of my jobs that I've had since then. And so I would say I grab a lot of coattails.
Well, you could say it that way. You could also say that, relationships have led you. I don't know how you got the job originally at Chick-fil-A. It might have been just applied there, but that relationships have kind of pulled you through to all the different positions you've been in. I mean, if I think about everything post Chick-fil-A, they've all been, the entry point has been somebody you've known. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And I think it's not just somebody you've known, but in most of those cases, it was somebody you knew that had 2 advantages: long-term connection to the community. The person you knew had long-term connections to the community, and then could pull the levers that allowed you to get those positions. but also you knew those people because of long-term connections to the community, right? And in other words, these were not people you should necessarily, I mean, in some cases, it was people you'd met recently, but you met them because of long-term sort of other relationships that led you to that one. I'm trying to remember the story correctly, but is that right?
Yeah. In fact, with him, I think the root connection was actually you, because you had connected him with my parents, and then my parents had the conversation to
Oh,
connect him with me.
I was thinking it was through your dad. Maybe that was that I had originally made some of
Mhm.
that introduction, but yeah. So I think that that's interesting in the sense that there's a community connection, and then that leads to opportunities. And then, let's make sure that we say this clearly. This is a benefit going both directions. The person who recommended you looked pretty spiffy because of the good work that you were able to do in the organizations that you were in. So, again, on a reflective level, let's look back and say, okay, Seth, so your friends went off to college, and in our area, a lot of your friends went off to the same college that we're all familiar with. And so they were there and they kind of had their experience, and you didn't, and you stayed here. So, okay, one of those benefits was a house. And so that's not an inconsequential benefit. The other was a launching of a career. You're now sitting here at what, 24 years old? Is that what we said? 24 years old with at least 4 years of serious professional experience, if not more. And so that's not inconsequential. But, what else do you think you lost, and what did you gain if you look back over that kind of time period and compare it to obviously a lot of friends who did on the more, again, quote unquote, traditional path?
It's interesting because I think back on what I would have lost with it, and I think that I really would have thrived and enjoyed in a traditional college environment.
Yes, I agree
I,
that you would have excelled on campus as well. Yeah.
my mom always said that I would have thrived if we had found a commune and set up shop there, because I would have had so many people to connect with. But yeah, I really like being with people. I'm an extrovert, and so I enjoy being with people and having conversations, asking questions. And so that's kind of what I would say that I feel like I missed. But especially within the last year, I've been a lot more intentional about initiating that kind of thing. And so I've been learning, yeah, if you want to hang out with people, send a text. If you want to hang out with people, ask the question. And so I've been able to lean into that and do that a little bit more with a lot of different people, of a lot of different age groups and from a lot of different areas. And so that's opened up a lot of doors to be willing to, because what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to more rejection. But being willing to do that and put yourself in that spot, I think, because I know that I would appreciate it if other people were willing to do that for me.
Yeah, well, that's something that I thought was really interesting is that I noticed a theme in that a lot of the different things that you've talked about that you've done that have gotten you to the point where you're at is that you looked at a situation where I think a lot of people would have seen like, okay, there's an outside cleaning crew. That's fine. And just like accepted the fact that just like that was the way that things were. You looked at your educational options, and a lot of other people would just accept like this is just the thing that you do. You had I would say the tenacity to be able to ask the question to say like, okay, what if we did this differently? What if there is another option? Like why is it that like this is the option that everybody is taking, and if it isn't the best option, then what is the best option that I can take that will set me up to go where we're looking to go? And I think that funny enough is something that we talk about a lot in Unbound is the fact that one of the most essential skills that you can have as a young adult is asking the right questions, asking good questions. And so I think that's something that you have seemed to have done really well. And so I'd be curious to hear your reaction as to how you think you have integrated asking the right questions into part of like how you go about making decisions.
I think a lot of people are afraid to ask questions because they're afraid of looking stupid. And so we all have this mask that we're trying to manage to make other people view us the way that we want to be viewed. And we look at other people and we do the same thing for them. And we look at how well their walls are painted. But I think that what's important is to ask the question that you have. If you're curious, to be curious and to dig into that. So if there's something that I am genuinely curious about, it's going to lead to a better conversation to ask those kinds of questions than if I ask the question that I think is going to come across as impressive. I that's what people are doing in job interviews. Have you ever, I bet sometimes you do, but more often than not, you have better conversations with your friends who know you well compared to in a job interview setting where you're meeting someone for the first time, because it's all impression. Everybody's trying to, oh, will this person like me? Will they not? And so in a setting like with a friendship, because that's really what it comes down to is, can you get people who are willing to commit to you even after you say stupid stuff and after they say stupid stuff, where you'll still commit to them? Because if you do that, then that gives you room to ask a lot of stupid questions. And then you're able to engage with one another's hearts, with one another's curiosity, instead of just playing this surface level mask game.
There's a definite thread that runs through this. I think your story earlier about I could spend $10 a day on a sandwich, or I could think about what would that $3,650 give me, at the other end. And it seems to me like you did that a lot with this whole process, right? I don't know that there's anything super difficult in terms of college is hard too about this, but it does require that next level thinking, which is at some point you said, why would I go to college and have a good time and spend a bunch of money, but I don't know what I'm going to do yet. And then, you came back and said, okay, well, I'm at Chick-fil-A. That's not going to be permanent. How's the way to move out of this? And at first it was a cleaning crew, and then it was, a leveraged opportunity through another friend. And then it was, okay, how are we going to advance in this? And then I think the really interesting part of that, and maybe the kind of really important point to look at, is that it didn't stop. There was a point where you said, now, wait a second, I need more of a community here. I need to connect to more people. How do I do that? And sort of looking forward and saying, what does that look like? And then being able to ask that question, send a text, and all those kinds of things. That's a pretty interesting golden thread that's running through all of this, which is the ability to look a little bit past and say, this is what everybody's doing, but what do I actually want? Where do I want to actually end up at? You said that you had a natural kind of tendency to save money earlier on. Well, this tendency to look through and see a little farther, was that something that you kind of, instilled by your parents and had as a kind of as a point growing up, or is that a new idea that you were exposed to?
Again, I feel like it's one of those things that was just a gift. Yeah, because I've always been that way, especially with money things. When I'm thinking about buying a phone plan and I hear how much Verizon costs, because that was what my family had. So sign up for the phone plan and start paying it. So I'm like, good grief, $40 a month. There's got to be something cheaper than that. And so then I find Mint Mobile, which I recommend to all of my friends because it's cheap.
Hey.
And so yeah, things like that. And then that was kind of my thought process with going, okay, do I rent? Do I keep paying for that? Or do I get a house? And so, yeah, I think seeing things in the long term is closer to the truth than seeing things in the short term, than seeing things just in the moment. And so I think that I think that oftentimes there are situations where we think we have to sacrifice one for the other. And if you do, then it's probably best to sacrifice the short term for the long term. But at the same time, I think that the way that Jesus kind of laid out for us to live is where the two intersect. Because I've been telling people, Jesus got the juice from the squeeze of life more than any 4 a.m. gym bro, even though they're up at 4 a.m. and trading stocks and everything, Jesus, where we write books about him called Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And so I look at Jesus for the examples. It's like, how do I maximize my life? Stop hurrying. It's an intersection between what does this look like long term, because he also lived the most effective long term life, and he also lived most effectively in the moment. I don't think that he ever gave the impression to people that he was rushing them, or that they were not important, or that he was moving on to the next thing. It was he engaged with people right where they were at. He engaged with people in the moment. He accepted that as a gift, but he was also recognizing that something bigger was at play. And I think that the more we model that in our lives, the better everything else goes.
Well, you ran an interesting contrast there between this, if we have to sacrifice between one or the other, sacrifice the short term for the long term. But you said something even more interesting, which is you think the long term allows you to have a better view of the truth. So talk a little bit more about that.
The long term is where we're going to be for a lot longer than we are right now. The short term is only going to last so long, but the things that we build up for the long term are going to be there for quite a while. And so it's something like buying a house, and a lot of these things too, like marriage, people commit to them before they have any idea what they got themselves into. And that was me with buying the house. I'm not married, But I think that that's kind of all the decisions that we make. We get into them a little bit, and the question that I think is important to ask is what is the direction of my heart in this decision? Not what is the place that I'm going to end up if I take this decision? Do I go right or do I go left? Because all these big drastic things could happen. It's like, no. Where's your heart at? Are you hurrying and are you anxious? Is this a decision that's motivated by your anxiety and your anger? Or is this a decision that's motivated by, I think a longer term perspective is the best, because you want to be in the place where your decisions are coming from a place of peace and contentment and acceptance, but that's not always possible. Sometimes you're going to have some anxiety and fear mixed in the cake there.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of people would say, okay, well, yeah, it's easy, Seth, to say a long-term decision is like buying a house. It's obviously it's got a 30-year mortgage attached or something like that. Some of the times we make decisions and it's more, I don't know if this is a short-term or long-term decision. I'm not sure, how this kind of plays out. And so is there things that you say like, in other words, I'm always going to choose this direction because these are the kinds of things that ultimately have long-term implications. These short-term things don't. And so go back to our financial example, buying a sandwich has a short-term implication, right? Putting that money in investment has a long-term implication. That's a pretty easy bifurcation to see between the two of those. Are there things like that? So you would say that, buying something I'm going to consume immediately that I don't necessarily need for survival is not as smart as putting in an investment that I can, get a benefit from 20 years from now. But, are there other things like that in other areas of life that you say, I'm always going to choose this direction because these things pay off long-term all the time?
Yeah, I think it's really different person to person. So for me, and you start to be able to make these decisions better when you get to know yourself a little bit more. And so for me, I know that my default is always going to be the long-term decision. And so recently I've been going, okay, how do I figure out what this kind of decision I'm going to make? And I have a really immature way about getting there, which is, do I want to? And so today I had one of those $10 sandwiches for breakfast because been feeling a little bit under the weather this week. And I was thinking, you know what? I'm going to start the day off right. By golly, I can go get one of those expensive sandwiches because I'm really going to enjoy that. And so and as I participate in this decision, can my heart be in a place of gratefulness for it? So for me, buying a sandwich, the answer is absolutely it can be.
Well, that's the second time you kind of referenced a heart issue here. So in this case, it was so I think your deeper answer there is a decision made out of gratefulness is better than one made out of, certainly anger or something like that. That might be a more stark contrast. But I think that's interesting. Gratefulness is not, there's a spectrum of that, right? There's even some things you could be angry about that you could still be grateful about. There's a mix there that's a little interesting. Earlier, you were talking about making decisions based on, I think you said, am I anxious or not hurrying? I think those are the two. So that's an interesting set of qualifications there. In answer to my question, a long-term decision is one that doesn't have an aspect of haste to it. A long-term decision as one that I can be grateful with. Anything else that you kind of tend to see that you use as a measurement there?
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about even social decisions. If I notice that, okay, I'm tempted to say this to this person, I'm tempted to interact this way, to either to avoid a person or to interact with the person. And so I try to kind of play to the opposite of where I feel like I sense the thing that I don't want. So if I sense anger, if I sense my huge desire to control things, then I will try to play to the opposite of that. Because more often than not, those are the emotions that are easier to pick up on than the gratitude and the gratefulness.
Yeah, there's a position some people take that, if it's hard, do it. I had a friend a long time ago that said he had gone from not fit to very fit. And I said, what was the plan to use? And he said, I did anything that was painful. And I did whatever it is. I did it until it hurt. And I figured that the hurt was an aspect of, now that may not necessarily be the best fitness plan, but there was an attitude there of like, if faced with easy and hard, I pick hard. And ultimately it makes, I think he actually had a variation of this that he talked about as kind of a personal mantra, if faced with hard or easy, I'm going to pick hard. And the assumption that long-term it'll become easy. And I think that's a little bit of what you're saying here, which is, what is just this is an odd word sometimes to use, but kind of a fleshly sort of response. What is the thing that gives me the short term satisfaction? And I think what you're talking about is almost building up a natural resistance to that. So your first instinct is to reject that one and look for the deeper one. Is that an accurate kind of reflection of what you're saying?
I think so. I was Another one of the habits that I've been participating in recently is taking a walk before work. And so I had been looking for, everybody always talks about it. I'm a Christian, obviously, but everybody always talks about doing a devotional time. And that had always been a pretty inaccessible way for me to, I guess, engage with God. I was never really motivated to sit down with my hot cup of coffee and my journal and everything and just get in there. But something that is very accessible for me is to take a walk in the morning, because that's something that I actually enjoy. And so again, I think that all of this is about how can I know myself and work with the natural push and pull of what my body is wanting and what is telling me to do. Because yeah, I bet you build a heck of a lot of discipline when you say, if I don't want to do it, then I will. And I do not have that discipline. And so I'm able to be more disciplined by going, okay, what are the things that I want to do? And how can I engage in the things, how can I merge the two?
Well, thanks, Seth. I appreciate it. This is a bit of a heavy ask to come in and say, hey, talk about your life as kind of an interesting thing. But I do think you've led an interesting life in the fact that you picked something a little bit different from the mainstream. And I know it's not been without sacrifice. I know it's not been without some struggle and some parts that were hard. But I think it's put you in a unique position that looks very different from a lot of folks your age. And I don't know that that's holding up as a blueprint about what everybody should do. But I think it is an interesting example of, if you're willing to think differently, you're likely to get to a different place. That maybe if there's one thing I might sort of pull out of all this, is that be willing to engage in that long-term thinking and ask yourself that kind of essential question: where is it that I want to end up? I think you're an interesting example of somebody who's asked that question and wound up someplace different. And it turns out to continue to be really interesting. So thanks for your time, and thanks for being willing to share. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, at the beginning of this, I couldn't remember the name of that podcast episode. It was Rethinking the Value of Higher Education. Is the episode we've done before that I said Seth might be an interesting answer to. And after you've listened to Seth, I think it's a good question to ask. It allows you to rethink the value of higher education. Seth took a different path, and I think it's been fascinating where he's ended up. And as you can hear, it's not that he just ended up with some interesting professional gains and a house out of it. He's actually a very, very thoughtful person. And I think, as I mentioned in the conversation with him, outside of my family, I'm not sure if I've had as many deep conversations that make me really think as I have with Seth. Also, Seth preaches from time to time. And let me tell you, as somebody who's been able to listen to that, come back and spend the rest of a Sunday afternoon mulling over some really important points. So he's a man of many talents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that he talked about that really stood out to me, at least, was when he was talking about, especially towards the end there, on how he goes about making some of the big important decisions, which, for those of you who might not know, we actually offer a course for young adults on how to make big life decisions without having stress or anxiety in the process. And I say that, and then my point on that is that when you're making a big decision, there's almost never going to be a complete lack of apprehension or hesitation or parts in your brain that are thinking but wow, this is a big decision. How in the world do I do this? More often than not, it is usually a matter of recognizing, okay, are those hesitations logical, or are they something that is just out of like an anxious place, or playing a what if game with yourself, and being able to recognize, okay, this is the kind of hesitation that I need to be able to push through, because I know that's where God is calling me. That's something that I know I personally have been learning a lot over the past year or two, is being able to recognize that feeling of, ooh, I'm uncomfortable with where I am potentially getting pushed in the direction of. But I think that's that's a feeling of discomfort that comes from me not wanting to get pushed out of my comfort zone, not me thinking that this is the wrong place to go. And often recognizing this is the right place to go and I need to push through this discomfort is how you get to some of the most valuable growth in your life.
Yeah, that decision-making course is called Navigate, and the first phase of that is we talk about orientation, which is asking the big question, the long-term questions, so you know where you're trying to go and ultimately end up, and how you determine if where you're going to end up is a good place. So like these really basic questions, which is interesting because in Seth's story, he really refers to that a lot. That he talks about it as a gift, and maybe it is that, but it's also something that has been honed through practice of this sort of reflection on what is this going to do if I eat $10 sandwiches every day? What is the long term implications of this? If I go to college and don't know what I want to do ultimately, what are the long term implications of this? And that kind of long term thinking, you don't have to be a strategic master. You don't have to plan out your entire life. But if you are willing to take that extra time to think about where do I want to end up, and is it logical that this path will get me there, that's a big deal. And that's very different from what most people do. And if you're willing to be different from most people, you'll get very different results from most people, and often exceptional results. And I think we've got a little bit of a story of that in our conversation today. So well, I hope that is inspiring to you. If you'd like to do things differently, may we suggest that there is a way to go about that. And Seth benefited from it, an earlier version of what we do now. But in many ways, the lessons that we learned from watching people like Seth do the things that he did have now been incorporated and really systematized into the current Ascend program. So Ascend is absolutely designed to produce a lot more people like Seth. Folks who come in and say, I am willing to think about this differently. Maybe I'm not sure what I want to do, but I want to learn skills that I know I'll use. I want to be able to get into this and do things differently and have different results from everybody else. And so, yeah, it's not just Seth. We know loads and loads and loads of students who came through our Ascend program, often didn't know what they wanted to do, but the Ascend program promises that you're going to have transferable skills no matter what you end up doing. And then often in the process of doing that, they go, oh, I want to concentrate on this. And then Ascend can double down and teach you the skills you need for that particular area or discipline. And then ultimately can put you in a position where you're not carrying a load of debt. You're well equipped to deliver a lot of value to a company or organization or to start your own business. You're able to do that. It's often an accelerated timetable. And so all of a sudden you're sitting there with not as many years as people think you'd have in terms of kind of where you are in your position professionally, possibly in terms of owning your own home and doing those kinds of things. So if you're interested in that kind of outcome, if you're willing to think differently, if Seth's story inspired you, then we do have a bit of a roadmap and a bit of a blueprint to help you do that. And so go to beunbound.us to check out our programs there, and particularly the Ascend program, which is designed to put people on routes that look an awful lot like what happened with Seth. So well, thank you so much for joining us once again for the Be Unbound podcast. And until we're here together again, and we've got a new guest and a new conversation for you to listen to, we'll leave you with this challenge to be unbound.